The barn had always stood like an old guardian on the far edge of the property, its weathered boards holding decades of memories that stretched far beyond the reach of any paperwork, committee, or neighborhood association. It had been built by the narrator's grandfather with his own calloused hands, not for beauty or convenience, but for survival, an honest structure raised in a time when land meant freedom, work meant dignity, and neighbors didn't need contracts to understand boundaries. For nearly half a century, the barn had been a quiet constant, resting in the same spot, untouched by time except for the gentle fading of its red paint and the slow settling of the earth beneath its foundation. Generations had come and gone, but the place always remained a symbol of continuity, a landmark on the narrator's sprawling acres that predated everything built around it. Even as the rural meadow transformed over the years, with paved driveways replacing gravel, cul-de-sacs replacing woodland trails, and newcomers replacing the old families who once knew every fence post by heart, the barn never changed its stance. It had watched the land evolve around it, but it never budged an inch. The narrator often found himself returning to it whenever life became overwhelming, leaning against its sturdy frame as if drawing strength from the past. His grandfather used to say that although everything could be taken by people who thought they held authority, land remembered its true owner. The barn, then, had been a reminder of that truth. But that truth was tested the day the HOA arrived, carrying rules and papers like weapons, and treating the land as if its history began only when they discovered a way to profit from it. When the housing development began creeping closer to the farmland, the narrator had known that problems were inevitable. HOA developments were always hungry for power, hungry for control, and hungry for anything that could be branded as community property, even when that community existed long after the real heritage of the land was established. The narrator had watched the development rise like a spreading vine, each new home built farther from the main entrance, inching closer to the open pasture that bordered his acreage. He was not part of their HOA. He had refused to join, refused to sign any paperwork that would tie him to their endless rules, refused to give strangers say over land that had been his family's for generations. At first, the HOA treated him with a kind of polite caution, the same way someone might approach a stray animal they were unsure would bite. They invited him to community meetings, slipped notices in his mailbox, and made attempts to include his land in their planning discussions, always with the same phrase, for the sake of unity. But the narrator had no interest in unity built on the premise of surrender. He had no reason to bow to a group formed barely a decade earlier, especially when his family had been on the land for nearly 6. His refusal seemed to bruise the pride of the HOA board, especially the president, a woman named Marlene who wore power like perfume and believed every property within her sightline should be under her authority. The day her eyes first lingered on the old barn was the day trouble began. She had approached the narrator with her clipboard tucked against her chest, squinting at the structure as if evaluating a defect. She used phrases like community aesthetic and safety compliance, hinting, never saying outright, that she believed the barn should fall under their regulation. The narrator smiled politely, knowing the barn sat several acres outside their mapped boundary. It wasn't even close, but he didn't confront her, not then. He let her walk away thinking whatever she wanted. What he didn't expect was that she would return not with a clipboard, but with a marching army of legal jargon. Weeks passed and letters began arriving, thin envelopes at first, then thick ones filled with documents printed in smug legalese. They claimed the barn sat on land that was measured in an outdated survey. And according to their new GIS mapping system, a portion of the structure now fell within their designated community land. They demanded access for inspections, demanded he bring the barn up to their code, demanded compliance fees, demanded control. At first, the narrator laughed. It was a ridiculous claim, absurd enough to ignore. But laughter turned to cold irritation when the HOA escalated the matter by placing bright orange notice of noncompliancy signs along the fence line, visible from the road. Neighbors began gossiping, some whispering that the barn was unsafe, others believing the narrator was in violation of HOA rules he never agreed to. The HOA had effectively painted him as the enemy of the community. a threat to their carefully manicured world of matching mailboxes, trimmed hedges, and silent subordination. But the worst moment came when Marlene herself marched onto his property with 2 board members behind her, announcing that they had voted to adopt the barn as shared community property, due to its location and scenic value. She spoke as if history meant nothing, as if legacy could be overwritten with a pen stroke. The narrator didn't argue. He didn't shout. He didn't waste words on people who believed authority came from titles instead of truth. Instead, he simply returned to the house, retrieved the metal lockbox that held his grandfather's original land documents, and placed it on the kitchen table. Inside it were old maps, handwritten surveys, boundary markers, and the original deed. Not digital files, not convenient PDF, but physical proof of the land's true measurements, stamped and notarized decades before the HOA existed. But old documents weren't enough. The narrator needed something irrefutable, something modern, something the HOA couldn't twist or dispute. So he made a call, hiring a licensed surveyor with decades of experience and a reputation for precision. The surveyor walked the land for hours, working his way around the trees, pastures, fences, and the barn itself, marking the same boundaries the narrator's family had respected for generations. When the surveyor finished, he handed over a sealed folder. Inside it was the truth, clear, precise, modern, legally verified, and the narrator knew exactly where he would use it: court, a place where egos were irrelevant and facts spoke louder than titles. As he prepared for the legal battle ahead, he felt the weight of history behind him. The HOA believed they could rewrite his land's identity with paperwork. They were about to learn that some lines on a map were carved far deeper than ink. And so the stage was set, the conflict brewing as the barn stood tall, unknowingly at the center of a storm that was about to explode into the open. The next chapter would begin not on the land itself, but in the courtroom, where truth waited to be unfolded like an old map, ready to expose every lie the HOA had built. The morning after receiving the finalized land survey, the narrator felt a renewed sense of quiet confidence settle over his property, but peace rarely lasted long whenever the HOA was involved. Trouble began just as the sun lifted over the eastern ridge, casting long shadows across the barn that now sat in the middle of a growing storm. The narrator had no illusions about the kind of fight ahead. He knew the HOA was not a group that accepted defeat gracefully, nor were they the type to back down simply because facts contradicted their ambition. If anything, their arrogance multiplied in the face of evidence, morphing simple disputes into full-blown crusades that they insisted on dragging through every bureaucratic avenue available. The signs of escalation arrived quickly. That morning, as the narrator made his way down the gravel path toward the barn, he noticed a cluster of HOA board members gathered near the property boundary. They stood in a rigid formation like foot soldiers awaiting orders, each holding clipboards or binders stuffed with documents. Their stiff postures and narrowed eyes made it clear they weren't visiting for neighborly conversation. They were preparing for confrontation. Shortly after, a loud knock echoed across the front porch. When the narrator opened the door, he found a man wearing a branded polo shirt, identifying him as the HOA compliance assessment contractor. He didn't bother hiding the smirk as he handed over a stack of papers. The top document was a so-called notice of structural violation, claiming the barn was unsafe and not in compliance with the HOA architectural guidelines, which was laughable considering the narrator wasn't a member of their association at all. The pages below were filled with citations, fines, orders to repair, demands for architectural review meetings, requests for photographs of the barn's interior, and even a proposed schedule for inspections, none of which had any legal authority on land the HOA didn't control. The narrator read each page with calm detachment. He wasn't surprised. This had become the HOA-favored tactic: bury the target in paperwork until they either gave up or submitted out of exhaustion. But the HOA had miscalculated. They assumed their victim would be like many others they had steamrolled, unprepared, overwhelmed, and intimidated. They didn't realize they were dealing with a man who had grown up repairing fence posts in freezing rain, raising livestock long before the board members had raised children, and watching storms roll across the fields without flinching. This wasn't his first battle with stubborn forces of nature, only now the storm had a human face. The narrator waited for the compliance contractor to leave before setting the stack of documents on his kitchen table beside the sealed survey folder. The contrast between the two piles made him almost laugh. On one side, a mountain of baseless accusations printed on cheap paper. On the other, a professionally certified survey that held the weight of law. But the HOA had only just begun their offensive. By noon, the narrator noticed new faces, nervous homeowners from the subdivision, walking along the edge of his property line. Some carried their own HOA newsletters, reading the bold headlines aloud: "Community land misuse at property border," "Non-compliant structure endangering home values," and "Legal action pending against adjacent property." The HOA propaganda machine was working overtime, twisting lies into neighborhood gossip and planting seeds of panic among residents. Soon rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the barn was about to collapse, others said it was illegal, and a few believed it was infested with mold that could drift into the community and make children sick. The narrator stood at a distance watching them inspect the property as if they were looking at a hazardous waste site. Their exaggerated expressions and dramatic hand waving would have been comical if it weren't so irritating. It amazed him how quickly fear replaced common sense in people who had lived next to his land peacefully for years. Yet none of them dared approach the narrator directly. They only glanced at him from afar, clutching their HOA newsletters as if holding onto shields. While the neighbors gossiped, the HOA board continued its campaign. In the late afternoon, the narrator heard the rumble of tires on gravel. An SUV with the HOA logo parked along the property edge, and outstepped the HOA president herself, Marlene. She wore oversized sunglasses that tried to mask her self-importance, but only emphasized it. Her posture radiated smug confidence as she marched toward the barn, waving her clipboard like a flag of conquest. The narrator didn't approach her. He stood with arms crossed at a distance, observing. Marlene circled the barn, scribbling notes as if performing a formal inspection. She took photographs, measured distances with a small device, and even knelt to examine the foundation stones. Her exaggerated diligence was unnecessary and absurd, especially since she had no permission to be on his land. When she finished, she turned and glared at the narrator with a victorious smirk, as if she had uncovered evidence of a crime. She returned to her SUV, slammed the door, and sped away. The narrator didn't need to guess what she would do next. By evening, another envelope appeared in the mailbox, this one thicker, stamped in bold red ink. Urgent. Final notice before escalation. Inside were more accusations, more threats, and a schedule for a mandatory HOA compliance hearing, which the narrator had no legal obligation to attend. Tucked at the bottom was an absurd claim. The HOA declared the barn a community resource building, insisting its layout made it ideal for storage, meeting space, and seasonal events. They argued that since it visually impacted the HOA, it should be considered part of the association's shared landscape. The narrator nearly tore the letter in half from frustration, but he instead set it beside the others, let them pile up. They would become evidence. The next morning brought another escalation, this time far more aggressive. A construction crew tracted by the HOA arrived near the boundary with trucks, orange cones, and surveying equipment of their own. They attempted to place stakes along the property line, marking the area the HOA claimed belonged to them. Their measurements were sloppy, hurried, and based entirely on the HOA misinterpreted GS image rather than legal records. The narrator watched silently from his porch as they hammered stakes into his land. He could have told them to leave. He could have shouted, argued, or demanded they stop, but he chose patience. Sometimes allowing an opponent to make mistakes only strengthened the case against them. So he took photographs, dozens of them. Every stake they placed served as additional proof of trespass. Later that afternoon, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived in response to a complaint filed by the HOA. They walked up the driveway with professional caution, explaining that the HOA claimed the narrator was threatening construction workers. and refusing to comply with community regulations. It was a clear manipulation designed to frame him as hostile, but the deputies quickly realized the truth when they examined the property records. They saw the original deed, compared it with the HOA documents, and concluded the HOA had overstepped. Although they couldn't order the construction crew to leave, civil disputes required court orders. They recorded the narrator's evidence and filed a report noting the HOA questionable behavior. By the next day, the HOA switched tactics yet again. They began contacting county offices, attempting to file complaints against the barn for zoning violations. They claimed the barn exceeded legal height limits, violated setback requirements, and lacked structural permits. They even tried to argue that its existence posed a visual nuisance to the subdivision. County officials, however, were not so easily manipulated. Several complaints were dismissed immediately, but one zoning officer, sensing conflict, decided to visit the barn personally. The narrator guided him across the property, explaining the land's history and showing him the new certified survey. The officer reviewed the details and shook his head with mild disbelief. It was clear the barn was entirely within the narrator's rightful property lines and that its construction predated modern zoning regulations, making it fully exempt. The officer documented everything and promised to file a formal statement verifying the barn's legality. The narrator felt a surge of relief, but he knew the HOA wouldn't stop now. They were too deep in their crusade, too prideful to admit defeat, too invested in their narrative to turn back. He could predict the next step, court. And he welcomed it. For every false claim, he had evidence. For every boundary the HOA tried to redraw, he had a survey. For every rumor they spread, he had the truth. By the end of the week, a certified letter arrived, official, heavy, stamped with legal authority. The HOA had filed a civil claim demanding ownership rights to the land beneath the barn, claiming it as community property, and seeking a court order to assert control over the structure. The narrator opened the envelope slowly, feeling the final shift in momentum. The HOA had declared war, but they had no idea that the battlefield they chose was one where facts, not arrogance, decided victory. And as he placed the court summons beside the sealed survey folder, he felt no fear, only resolve. Everything was moving exactly where he needed it to go. The barn would stand, the truth would unfold. And the next chapter would be fought not on the land, but in the courtroom, where the HOA empire of assumptions was about to collapse under the weight of reality. The weeks that followed were wrapped in a tense, simmering atmosphere that never quite settled. For the first time in his life, Mark felt a sense of intrusion on land he had always believed to be unquestionably his. Every sunrise over the rolling fields seemed slightly dimmed by the uncertainty looming over his future, even though he maintained a calm front. The barn, his grandfather's legacy, stood as solid as ever, but the HOA shadow over it now created a sensation like an invisible hand slowly tightening around the property. As winter began its slow crawl into the valley, the HOA escalated their efforts. They sent formal complaints, each letter typed in clinical precision, with accusations worded to imply Mark had intentionally encroached on community land. It infuriated him to read the smug undertones, as though they had already won. Still, he didn't retaliate with emotion. He collected each letter, organized them in a folder, and tucked them neatly alongside the deeds and documents he had inherited. Everything would matter later. He felt it deep in his bones. Rumors began to spread across the community, fueled by the HOA members who whispered about the man who built a barn illegally. Some neighbors started to avoid Mark altogether, and others simply watched from a distance with curiosity or quiet sympathy. Mark didn't engage with any of them. He poured his focus into preparing for the battle he knew was coming. The land surveyor he hired, a seasoned professional named Sullivan, arrived early one frosty morning. The man carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had measured more disputes than he could count. Together, they walked the old property lines, tracing the markers that had faded over time. Sullivan studied the landscape with a methodical care that reminded Mark of his grandfather's patient precision when tending to crops. He drove stakes, consulted old maps, and worked from dawn until dusk. When the final measurements were taken, Sullivan gave a knowing nod, almost amused by what he discovered. Mark didn't need the verbal confirmation. The nod alone told him everything. The barn was precisely where it was supposed to be, well within the boundaries outlined in documents older than the HOA itself. The relief washed over him, but it was accompanied by new determination. He knew the HOA wouldn't simply admit defeat without a spectacle. As expected, the HOA doubled down. They filed an official notice demanding access to the land for their own survey. Mark allowed it because he had nothing to hide. 3 board members arrived with their contracted survey team, marching with the arrogance of people who believed results could be forced into alignment with their agenda. What they found, however, was inconvenient truth. Their surveyor hesitated with every measurement, uncomfortable with the inevitable conclusion. He quietly informed the board that the barn appeared to be on Mark's land. The board members exchanged frustrated glances, their lips pressed into thin lines of irritation, but their pride didn't allow them to accept the results. They dismissed their own surveyor and insisted the measurements were wrong. They sent yet another letter, insisting the barn still violated the community's land use charter. Mark realized then that this was no longer a misunderstanding, it was a power grab, pure and simple, and he refused to bow to it. The community grew even more divided as word spread of the conflicting surveys. Some residents believed the HOA narrative because they trusted authority blindly. Others, particularly older locals, nodded knowingly when they heard Mark's explanation, remembering the farmland long before the HOA ever existed. Yet even those who privately supported him hesitated to speak publicly against the board, fearful of retaliation. Winter deepened, the barn creaked softly under blankets of frost. The fields grew stiff and silent, hiding their strength beneath frozen soil. In that stillness, Mark prepared. He gathered every historical record his grandfather had kept, yellowed documents, maps drawn in precise lines, notarized transfers of ownership. He studied them late into the night, marking dates and cross-referencing notes. The entire history of the land unfolded before him like a story only he had ever bothered to read. When the HOA filed a lawsuit accusing him of illegal construction, trespassing on community land, and violating structural codes, Mark felt the weight of the moment settle into place. They wanted a fight, and they were going to get one. His lawyer, a woman named Margaret with a reputation for dismantling weak arguments, spent hours reviewing his evidence. Her expression shifted from curiosity to interest to outright disbelief as she pieced together the contradictions in the HOA claims. She told Mark plainly that the board had overreached, and badly. They had filed a lawsuit with no solid foundation. In her opinion, the case wouldn't survive an hour in front of a judge, but she also warned him that HOA-driven cases were rarely simple. They relied on intimidation and procedural pressure. The upcoming trial wouldn't be pleasant. Mark accepted this calmly. He wasn't fighting for convenience. He was fighting for legacy. The barn represented years of hard labor, family history, and the last tangible trace of his grandfather's dedication. Losing it wasn't an option. On the morning of the hearing, Mark felt strangely grounded. The courtroom was a sterile, quiet place, with polished floors and muffled footsteps that made every movement feel heavy with significance. The HOA board members entered with stiff shoulders, trying to mask their nervousness behind forced confidence. Their attorney, a sharply dressed man with a rehearsed smile, carried a stack of papers meant to appear imposing. Mark sat at his table with his documents neatly arranged. Margaret whispered a final reassurance before the session began. When the judge entered, the room shifted, an unmistakable sensation of authority settling into place. The HOA presented their argument first, spinning a narrative of community violation, unauthorized structures, and misuse of shared land. Their attorney spoke with theatrical emphasis, waving his hands over maps and photos that attempted to depict the barn as an intruder on property that somehow belonged to all residents. Mark listened quietly, absorbing every misstatement, every exaggerated claim, every omission of crucial facts. He didn't grumble or scowl. He simply waited. When the time came, Margaret rose and began presenting their evidence with a confidence that immediately changed the energy in the room. She laid out historical ownership documents, detailed maps, and decades-old survey records. The judge listened carefully, absorbing each detail, but everything shifted when Margaret unfolded Sullivan's professionally verified survey. a large, clear document showing the exact property lines. The moment it unfurled across the courtroom table, the room went silent. The judge leaned forward, studying the numbers and markings with a raised eyebrow. Something in his expression softened into amusement. And in that stillness, Mark knew the tide had turned. The silence that settled over the courtroom after the survey was revealed felt heavier than any argument that had been spoken that morning. It was a silence built from unraveling confidence, collapsing strategy, and the unmistakable realization that the foundation of the HOA case was crumbling beneath them. The judge traced the property lines with a slow, deliberate movement, the tip of his finger following each measurement as though verifying the land with his own sense of logic. His posture shifted from formal attentiveness to something bordering on incredulous amusement. It was subtle, but everyone in the room could feel it. The barn, according to the survey, sat squarely in the middle of Mark's property, far from any boundary the HOA claimed it had crossed. The judge leaned back in his chair, not speaking yet, but the faintest shake of his head made the HOA board members stiffen. In that moment, the energy in the room changed, as if the walls themselves understood the absurdity of the situation. Margaret paused her explanation, giving the judge space to absorb the evidence. The HOA attorney shifted where he stood, the veneer of confidence draining from his posture. He cleared his throat quietly, but the sound only drew attention to how uncomfortable he suddenly was. The judge finally looked up. His eyes moved slowly from Margaret to the massive unfolded survey, then to the HOA attorney, who now seemed several sizes smaller than he had at the start of the day. Though the judge spoke few words, the meaning was unmistakable. He had seen enough to recognize that the HOA entire argument hinged on an interpretation that simply did not exist in reality. With that, Margaret continued laying out additional evidence, confirming historical ownership and rights recorded decades prior. She moved with calm precision, leaving no corner of the case unaddressed. Each document she presented reinforced the same conclusion: the barn belonged on that land, and the land belonged to Mark. When she finished, the judge gestured for the HOA to respond. Their attorney straightened his papers with hands that were no longer steady. He attempted to construct a counterpoint, referencing ambiguous clauses in community guidelines that he claimed suggested an overlap, but with the survey spread open like a declaration of truth, his words held no weight. The judge interrupted him gently but firmly, asking whether the HOA had any factual evidence, documented, measured, or historically recorded, that contradicted the survey. The attorney hesitated. He glanced toward the board members, who sat rigid, trying to telegraph something through their tight expressions. But no amount of stern eye contact could fabricate evidence that didn't exist. When the attorney finally admitted they had no additional documentation, the judge's expression shifted fully into disbelief. The hearing continued, but the outcome had become inevitable. The judge pointed out inconsistencies in the HOA claims, questioned their interpretation of land use guidelines, and scrutinized the decision to escalate the matter without verifying foundational property information. His tone grew sharper with each contradiction he uncovered. It was clear that he was not simply annoyed. He was offended by the waste of the court's time. By the time the HOA rested their case, their argument had transformed from confident assertion into a fragile explanation, riddled with qualifiers and hopes of technical loopholes. The judge announced a brief recess before delivering his ruling. As everyone rose, the HOA members hurried into the hallway with stiff, rapid steps, whispering harshly among themselves. Their expressions shifted between panic and denial, their carefully curated authority finally showing cracks. Margaret turned to Mark and offered a small nod, not triumphant, but affirming. She could see from the judge's reaction that the case was already decided. Mark stepped outside the courtroom for a moment, breathing in the cool air that drifted through the open windows of the courthouse corridor. The winter scent felt lighter now, less oppressive, as though the weight pressing against his chest had lifted slightly, but beneath the relief was a deeper, steadier emotion, vindication. He had known the truth from the beginning, but now others could see it too. When court resumed, the finality of the moment hung in the air like a drawn curtain waiting to fall. The judge wasted no time. He began by summarizing the evidence, his voice carrying the controlled firmness of someone accustomed to seeing through theatrics. He stated plainly that the barn was fully and legally situated on Mark's private property, supported by documented surveys, historical deeds, and unbroken chains of ownership. He acknowledged the HOA claims, but noted that they were built on assumptions rather than verifiable land records. Then came the moment the HOA feared most. The judge criticized the board for overstepping its authority, weaponizing ambiguous guidelines, and initiating legal action without proper verification. He spoke with a sternness rarely heard in community disputes. The courtroom remained utterly still. His ruling followed. The HOA lawsuit was dismissed in its entirety. Furthermore, due to the baseless nature of the claims and the unnecessary expenditure forced upon Mark through their misconduct, the HOA would be required to compensate him for legal fees, an amount likely to reach thousands. A ripple of reaction passed through the room. Relief washed over Mark, but it was tempered by the cold, stunned silence coming from the HOA members. They sat frozen, absorbing the judge's words with pale faces and trembling frustration. Margaret thanked the court calmly. Mark remained composed, though inside the victory felt immense. It wasn't a moment for gloating, but rather a reclaiming of something that had been threatened: his family's legacy, his peace, and his rights. When the judge adjourned the session, people began filtering out in murmurs. Some spectators exchanged looks that conveyed quiet satisfaction. Others, particularly those connected to the HOA, wore expressions of disbelief. Word of the ruling spread quickly through the courthouse, and by the time Mark stepped into the lobby, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet conversation about the outcome. Outside, the cold air nipped at his face as he walked toward his truck. He heard hurried footsteps behind him. The HOA board members followed, their movements sharp and frantic. They weren't chasing him to apologize. Instead, they were arguing among themselves, voices low but tense. Their unity, once displayed proudly in meetings and neighborhood letters, was splintering under the pressure of consequence. Mark didn't stop to listen. Their unraveling was no longer his concern. As he started the engine, the exhaustion of the past months began to seep into his muscles. Relief mixed with lingering irritation at how far things had been pushed, all of it over a barn that had existed peacefully for generations. He drove home through quiet roads dusted with frost, the familiar landscape offering a comforting contrast to the chaos of the courtroom. When he turned onto his long gravel driveway, the barn came into view. It stood unchanged, indifferent to the human conflict surrounding it. Its weathered boards, sturdy frame, and timeless presence radiated a sense of endurance. It had survived storms, seasons, and now the misguided ambition of the HOA. That evening, Mark walked the perimeter of the barn, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. He paused occasionally, running his hand along the rough wood, remembering his grandfather's stories and the work that built this place. The legal battle had threatened to sever the connection he felt to this land, but instead, it had reaffirmed it. He realized that while the ruling had ended the court fight, the HOA frustration would not simply vanish. People who operated through control rarely accepted defeat quietly, and he was right. The following days revealed new ripples of conflict. The HOA board held emergency meetings, their newsletters filled with vague statements about ongoing community concerns. Some neighbors began checking in with Mark, cautiously testing how he felt after the ruling. Others kept their distance, either embarrassed or attempting to avoid taking sides. The community tension didn't disappear, it simply shifted, but Mark felt stronger now, grounded by the court's validation and unshaken by the HOA lingering resentment. He had defended what mattered, and he was prepared to do so again if necessary. As the final days of winter crept in, Mark sensed that the board's defeat was only the beginning of a deeper unraveling, one that would expose much more than a dispute over land. The days following the court ruling unfolded like slow, burning chaos within the HOA, though from the outside, neighborhood appeared unchanged. Driveways were shoveled, porch lights blinked on at dusk, and holiday decorations appeared like any other year. Yet beneath that calm veneer, tension rippled through the community like a wire pulled too tight. Word of the courtroom humiliation traveled fast, carried from porch to porch, whispered across backyard fences, and woven into morning conversations at the local diner where neighbors gathered for coffee. The story grew with each retelling, a judge laughing, documents scattering across a table, the HOA fumbling before the entire room. Some retellings were exaggerated, but the essence remained the same. The HOA had launched a battle it had no right to start, and they had lost spectacularly. Inside the subdivision, the board scrambled to regain control of their narrative. Emergency meetings were held in the clubhouse, the parking lot filled with stiff-backed members marching inside with stacks of papers clutched to their chests as though preparing for war. Their voices rose through the thin walls as accusations were exchanged behind closed doors. Blame became the new currency. Some pointed at the board president, accusing her of overreach. Others blamed the treasurer for authorizing legal spending without consulting the broader membership. Still, others blamed the attorney who had, in their eyes, failed them in court. The unity they once flaunted fractured under the weight of exposure. That fracture spread outward. Homeowners who had once supported the board with blind confidence now questioned everything they touched. Residents who had previously stayed neutral found themselves quietly distancing from HOA activities. A few families openly confronted board members during their morning walks, demanding answers about how their dues had been spent so recklessly. Signs of division became increasingly visible. Fewer residents showed up to HOA events. The once active community forum grew silent except for a handful of complaints, many of which were thinly veiled attacks aimed at the board. Even long-standing friendships showed strain as neighbors disagreed over who was at fault. Through all of this, Mark kept to his routine, maintaining his land with the same steady diligence as he always had. He didn't need to intervene or retaliate. The HOA undoing had begun the moment they decided to pursue a false claim, but he wasn't immune to the shift around him. Neighbors approached him during errands or while he repaired fencing near the road. Their voices carried a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. Some apologized for not speaking out sooner. Others expressed frustration with the board's behavior, admitting that they had felt uneasy long before the lawsuit, but didn't know how to oppose it. Mark accepted their gestures with calm politeness. He didn't hold grudges, but he didn't forget either. His priority was the land, the barn, and the generational promise woven into both. Yet as the days passed, he sensed a deeper change building beneath the surface, something far more consequential than community gossip or internal disagreements. The HOA finances were unraveling. The legal fees ordered by the judge were substantial, and the board had dipped far deeper into the association's funds than anyone realized. When the treasurer was pressed for answers, he hesitated too long, revealing what many feared. Their accounts were dangerously low. For years, the board had operated with minimal oversight, redirecting funds for projects that were never completed and legal consultations that residents knew nothing about. The lawsuit against Mark had been the final blow, consuming what remained of their financial buffer. At the next HOA meeting, dozens of frustrated residents showed up, more than the board had ever expected. The room was packed wall to wall. People stood shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Their voices erupted the moment the meeting began. Questions came rapid fire. How much money had been spent? Who approved the expenditures? Why had no one been informed? Where were the financial reports from the last 2 years? The board members struggled to maintain authority. Papers rustled, voices cracked, and attempts to restore order were drowned beneath waves of protest. The board president, who once carried herself with unwavering confidence, now looked overwhelmed. Her explanations were vague, her tone defensive. She tried to redirect blame toward Mark, claiming he had escalated the situation. But the residents weren't buying it. They had seen the court documents, they had heard the outcome. They knew the fault lay squarely with the board's arrogance. The anger sharpened. Some demanded resignations. Others demanded reimbursement. A few even suggested dismantling the HOA altogether. The foundation of control that the board once relied on was eroding right under them. When the meeting disbanded, people left in clusters, their conversations full of indignation and disbelief. The board members remained inside long after the room emptied, their voices hushed but frantic. Over the next few days, changes swept through the neighborhood like falling dominoes. 2 board members resigned publicly. Rumors spread that the treasurer was stepping down next. Residents formed an independent committee to audit the HOA finances, gathering volunteers with backgrounds in accounting, law, and local governance. The board attempted to resist the audit, but they no longer had the backing to stop it. Their authority had withered, and still, they simmered with resentment. They saw Mark as the catalyst, even though their own choices had built the disaster. Mark observed the unraveling from a distance. He didn't celebrate it. He didn't interfere, but he watched, understanding that the story wasn't finished. The HOA wasn't done with him. Their pride was wounded, and people who built their identity on control rarely surrendered quietly. As winter deepened and frost clung to the fields each morning, the community shifted into a new stage, one where distrust hung in the air heavier than the cold. The HOA was weakened, divided, and desperate. And desperate institutions make reckless decisions. Mark sensed that something was coming, something quieter than a lawsuit, but potentially more disruptive. The barn stood solid against the landscape, as though reassuring him. Yet even that sight couldn't fully quiet the feeling that the HOA next move was already taking shape in the shadows of their downfall. The unraveling of the HOA should have marked the end of the conflict, but life has a way of stretching tension long after the breaking point. The judgment against the board shook their authority, weakening their influence across the community. Yet it also ignited something far more volatile beneath their fractured unity. A quiet desperation settled over them, a mixture of humiliation and the lingering belief that their power was slipping away forever unless they acted quickly. And desperate people, especially those accustomed to control, often turn to unpredictable methods to reclaim what they lost. In the weeks following the chaotic community meeting, the HOA board moved like a wounded animal, cornered, erratic, and searching for anything that could restore their dominance. The president, once confident and authoritative, now operated with a nervous stiffness that was obvious even to her closest allies. The remaining board members tried to rally support by painting themselves as protectors of neighborhood order, but fewer residents were willing to listen. Every attempt to regain footing exposed another fracture, another misstep. Yet the more the board's influence shrank, the more determined they became to reassert their presence. They started small, subtle. Notices began appearing in mailboxes again, though their language had changed. Instead of the assertive tone they once used, the letters carried an almost passive-aggressive edge. Policies, reminders, and thinly veiled attempts at re-establishing compliance. Some notices were legitimate concerns about landscaping or noise complaints, but most were nitpicking details no one had cared about before. They targeted homeowners they assumed would be easiest to intimidate, hoping someone would fold and restore the illusion of power. But the strategy failed. Residents no longer viewed the board with respect. Instead, the notices fueled irritation. Some people ignored them entirely. Others added them to growing piles of HOA mail they now considered useless. Few even posted the notices online to mock the board, spreading awareness of their desperation beyond the neighborhood's boundaries. The backlash did not go unnoticed. Inside the HOA leadership, frustration simmered into anger. Their petty attempts at regaining control had only highlighted their loss of it. They shifted their focus, searching for a new target, someone they could use to reassert authority in a way that appeared justified. It didn't take long for them to settle on a familiar name. Mark had become unintentionally a symbol of their defeat. His courtroom victory had not only embarrassed the board but exposed the depth of their mismanagement. To them, he represented everything they could not control: an independent landowner, unaffected by their rules, admired by neighbors for his resilience. The board convinced themselves that if they could undermine him somehow, they might salvage their authority in the community's eyes. They didn't need a lawsuit this time. They needed something quieter, more insidious. It began with vehicles, strange ones, not the usual cars that occasionally turned around near his driveway, but unfamiliar trucks that lingered too long at the edge of his property. They arrived during odd hours, often parking at different angles as if trying to study the land without drawing attention. Their engines idled longer than necessary before they pulled away. At first, Mark dismissed them as lost drivers or curious neighbors. But the frequency increased. The trucks came in different colors, with plates from various counties. None of the drivers stepped out, and none approached the house. They simply lingered near the property line, watching. Mark took note, making mental logs of each occurrence. The behavior wasn't threatening, Not yet, but unusual enough to sharpen his instincts. Then came the drone. One crisp afternoon, as Mark was repairing a section of fencing near the northern pasture, a faint mechanical hum drifted through the air. At first, he assumed it was a distant tractor or a neighbor running equipment. But the sound grew louder, sharper, shifting in pitch as it approached overhead. When he looked up, a drone hovered just beyond the tree line. It wasn't high enough to be mistaken for recreational flying. It hovered with intent, adjusting its angle as though capturing footage. The drone remained for several minutes before drifting away toward the direction of the subdivision. Mark's jaw tightened, but he did not chase after it. He simply noted what he'd seen. The pattern was becoming clear. The board was too afraid for another public confrontation, too financially unstable for another lawsuit, and too scrutinized by the community to attempt anything overt. So they turned to tactics meant to unsettle: surveillance, suspicion, silent pressure. But these efforts only strengthened Mark's resolve. He installed additional cameras around the property, all of them discreet. He adjusted the lighting near the barn and entrance, ensuring visibility over every angle. He reinforced documentation of his land boundaries, storing copies both digitally and in a fireproof safe. He notified the sheriff's office about suspicious vehicles, not as accusations, but as documentation. Patterns mattered, especially in rural areas where land disputes often escalated. The HOA grew bolder as winter began loosening its grip. Having received no pushback from their subtle probing, they believed they were regaining strategic ground. They sent anonymous complaints to county inspectors, claiming violations on Mark's property. Their hope was simple. If they could trigger official scrutiny, they could weaken him without exposing their own involvement. Inspectors arrived unexpectedly one morning, apologetic as they explained they were following up on anonymous reports. They walked the property, examined the barns, the fencing, the drainage, and the equipment. They found nothing concerning. In fact, they commended Mark on the upkeep and organization of his land. The inspection reports listed the property as pristine, compliant with all county regulations. The attempt to undermine him had failed again. The HOA grew increasingly reckless. Their phone calls to county offices became more frequent. Their messages filled with exaggerated claims about environmental hazards, unauthorized structures, and livestock issues. But each complaint dissolved under the weight of truth. Nothing on Mark's land breached any rules. Every accusation only strengthened his documented history of compliance. The board, blinded by desperation, refused to accept their failures. Their meetings grew more frantic. Their newsletters became curt and defensive. Neighbors began distancing themselves from the remaining leadership entirely, some refusing to pay upcoming dues until the financial audit was completed. The audit itself uncovered even more mismanagement than expected. Missing receipts, unauthorized expenditures, conflicting reports. Residents were furious, and through it all, the board continued fixating on Mark. Their obsession grew into something almost irrational. To them, he embodied the shift in power. If they could tear him down or even inconvenience him enough, maybe the community would forget the embarrassment of the lawsuit. But their efforts only made them look more unhinged. One night, long after the last lights in the subdivision flickered out, Mark stood outside near the barn, the cold wind brushing against his jacket. The land was quiet, the sky moonlit and clear. From the distance, he saw headlights moving slowly near the entrance of his property. They didn't pull in this time. Instead, they crept along the perimeter road, pausing briefly before continuing onward. Mark didn't need confirmation anymore. The pattern was undeniable. The HOA wasn't merely retaliating, they were spiraling. Their actions, once calculated and tied to policy, had devolved into something fueled by bruised egos and panic. A board that once operated with arrogant confidence now acted like a fragmented group, trying desperately to maintain relevance. But while they targeted Mark, they failed to see how many eyes were on them. Residents had grown tired. They were watching, waiting for the next misstep that would push the board past a point of no return. And that moment was coming faster than anyone realized. Because what began as petty retaliation was about to escalate into something far more dangerous. An act born from recklessness and pride that would finally expose the HOA downfall for all to see. The quiet tension in the community was no longer temporary. It was the precursor to a collapse that would shake the entire neighborhood. The board had spent months trying to reclaim their power. They didn't know they were on the verge of losing everything. The courthouse parking lot was nearly full by the time the hearing resumed, the word spreading quickly that the HOA case was spiraling into public spectacle. What began as a quiet land dispute had now become the kind of rural drama that locals found themselves drawn to, half out of curiosity and half out of incredulity. The idea that an HOA, built decades after a farm was already established, would claim ownership over a barn that had stood longer than most of its board members had even lived in the state seemed absurd enough. But as the case deepened, as documents were revealed, emails were exposed, and motives slowly surfaced, the absurdity transformed into something heavier, something tinged with suspicion and inevitable consequences. The farmer walked into the courthouse knowing today's testimony would be critical. The previous days had peeled back the surface of incompetence within the HOA, but today promised something different, something deeper and more revealing. His attorney moved with a steady confidence, carrying a growing stack of binders filled with copies of surveys, land grants, aerial footage, and notarized letters. Across the aisle, the HOA board members sat stiffly, their faces revealing varying shades of dread, exhaustion, and poorly concealed anger directed not at the farmer, but at one another. The cracks that began earlier were widening fast, and everyone knew that this phase of the hearing would either salvage their case or dismantle it entirely. As the court clerk called the session to order, the energy in the room shifted, settling into the quiet tension that often precedes a pivotal moment in any legal conflict. The judge appeared more expectant than before, keenly aware that the evidence scheduled for review would determine the direction of the case. After the preliminary motions, the attorney hired by the HOA took the floor. His body language hinted at discomfort, as if forced to defend something he no longer fully believed in. When he laid out the HOA claim, it sounded oddly hollow, detached from confidence. He repeated the same point, that according to their internal mapping, the barn appeared to sit partially on land under the HOA jurisdiction. But when he presented their version of a map, the courtroom reacted with a soft but unmistakable shift in posture. It was not a legal map, it was not professionally surveyed, it was simply a printed image from an old HOA brochure, enlarged poorly, with boundary lines drawn by hand and marker. The judge stared at the flimsy map for a long moment, then looked back at the attorney with a level, patient stare that conveyed more than a reprimand ever could. The courtroom knew the HOA credibility had just taken another blow. The farmer's attorney, sensing the moment, rose with a calm and deliberate presence. When he began presenting the counter evidence, he didn't rush. He walked the judge through the original county survey, then the restoration survey done when the barn was repaired decades ago, and finally the most recent, professionally stamped survey, completed only months earlier. All three matched. All three confirmed the barn was fully and unquestionably on the farmer's land. Then came the next layer, aerial photographs taken over the decades by the state agriculture department. Each photo showed the barn in the same spot, unmoved, untouched, and undeniably outside any HOA development footprint. The photographs became unavoidable visual truth, but the crushing blow wasn't the surveys or the photographs. It was the revelation hidden in the email trail. The farmer's attorney opened a new binder, flipped several pages, and handed copies to the judge. These weren't maps. They weren't surveys. They were internal HOA emails, reluctantly provided under subpoena. The first email revealed that certain board members were aware months earlier that the barn was legally outside HOA jurisdiction. Another showed that a board member pushed to continue anyway, believing that the farmer would eventually give up rather than fight. The judge's eyebrow lifted sharply at that phrasing, but the attorney continued, revealing an even more startling email. An exchange planning to convert the barn area into a community storage facility if they succeeded in pressuring the farmer to comply or relocate. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, subdued but powerful. The foundation of the HOA argument was collapsing, not because the farmer outmaneuvered them, but because their own documents exposed their intentions. The judge took several moments to read through the emails, and those brief moments stretched into a heavy silence. The entire courtroom felt the weight of it. Even the HOA board members seemed to shrink in their seats, shoulders rounding as if physically trying to hide from the words typed in their own digital correspondence. When the judge finally set the papers down, the shift in atmosphere became unmistakable. The case was no longer a simple land dispute. It had transformed into an examination of negligence, attempted overreach, and willful misrepresentation. The farmer felt a swirl of emotions, vindication, relief, exhaustion, but he kept his expression steady. He had spent months preparing for this moment, and he knew the danger of reacting too soon. His attorney wasn't finished. For the next part, he introduced testimony written by the county surveyor, who confirmed that the HOA had never requested an official boundary check before sending violation letters. This meant the entire conflict could have been avoided with a single phone call. Even the judge paused at that point, visibly stunned at the incompetence or the arrogance, perhaps both, that allowed the dispute to escalate so far. As the testimony and evidence accumulated, the HOA attorney attempted to object several times, but his objections lacked force. The judge overruled nearly all of them, citing the relevance and necessity of the presented information. Every overrule chipped away at the last remaining defenses the HOA had. By the time the farmer's attorney concluded, the facts formed a mountain no opposing argument could climb. When the HOA attorney returned for cross, the desperation became increasingly noticeable. He tried to question the validity of the aerial photographs, but they were government records. He attempted to dismiss the surveys, but they were certified. He tried to argue that the emails were taken out of context, but they were written plainly and without ambiguity. The judge's patience thinned. The HOA had no ground left. Finally, after an exhausting afternoon of unraveling their case, the judge called for a recess before closing arguments. As the courtroom emptied into the hallway, the reactions varied wildly. Some residents from the HOA community looked furious, not at the farmer, but at their own board for dragging them into an expensive, embarrassing lawsuit. Others whispered anxiously about the possibility of increased dues to cover the inevitable legal fees. Meanwhile, the HOA board members huddled together, whispering quickly, their panic showing in every gesture. The farmer stepped outside, letting the cool air settle his nerves. The weight of the coming conclusion felt heavy but hopeful. He knew the judge had seen everything he needed to see. He also knew that the next session would determine the final ruling, and whether the HOA would bear the consequences of its actions. As he stood with the late, noon sun settling behind the courthouse roofline, he sensed the story was nearing its peak. Truth had finally come out in full, and what remained now was judgment, and with judgment would come repercussions. Repercussions the HOA was clearly unprepared to face. Moments later, the bailiff called everyone back inside. The courtroom filled once more, tension saturating the air. The judge's expression had sharpened into one of finality. Everyone braced for what would come next. And as the gavel struck lightly to signal the session reopening, the room fell into a profound silence, preparing for the turning point that would define everything that followed. The truth had been exposed. Now came accountability, and the barn, the land, and the farmer's legacy were about to receive the long-awaited justice they deserved. The final day of the hearing arrived with a heavy, expectant atmosphere. Courthouse corridors, usually quiet and orderly, buzzed with whispers of anticipation. Locals, neighbors, and even a few curious onlookers packed the benches, their attention focused on a case that had long since become the talk of the town. Farmer entered calmly, carrying only his documents and a quiet confidence born of months of preparation. He had lived with uncertainty for too long to allow nerves to dictate his actions now. Margaret, his attorney, moved efficiently beside him, reviewing notes one last time and giving subtle gestures of reassurance. Across the aisle, the remaining HOA board members sat stiffly, shoulders rigid, eyes darting to each other with thinly concealed panic. They had spent weeks attempting to regain authority through small, underhanded tactics, yet each effort only revealed the widening gap between their ambition and reality. Their internal disarray had become public knowledge, and their credibility, already fractured, now teetered on the edge of complete collapse. The judge entered with a measured pace, exuding authority that seemed to fill every corner of the room. His eyes swept across the courtroom, pausing briefly on each person present, before settling finally on the board and the farmer. The weight of expectation pressed down on the HOA members, as though the walls themselves were poised to witness the fall of an empire built on arrogance rather than fact. Opening remarks were brief. The farmer's attorney summarized the historical ownership, the verified surveys, and the legal precedents that supported the property's boundaries. The air in the courtroom was heavy but quiet, each attendee aware that every piece of evidence presented previously had already stripped the HOA of credibility. The board's attorney rose to make a final plea, but it came across as desperate. He waved maps and repeated arguments that had already been disproven, each objection falling flat against decades of documented history. The judge's patience was apparent. Every time the attorney attempted to sidestep the overwhelming proof, the gavel tapped lightly, a reminder that theatrics could not substitute for reality. Then came the point that solidified the inevitability of the ruling. Margaret presented a chronological timeline of correspondence, surveys, and public records that traced the barn's presence on the property for decades. She methodically juxtaposed the HOA claims against historical evidence, exposing not only their errors, but also their attempts to manipulate perception. The final exhibit, a side-by-side comparison of aerial photographs spanning 50 years, made the truth undeniable. Each image showed the barn in the same position, untouched by HOA boundaries, standing as a testament to permanence, persistence, and the accuracy of proper documentation. The judge studied the visual evidence carefully. His finger traced lines across the photographs, pausing on specific details of the property boundaries. He leaned back in his chair, an unmistakable expression of disbelief forming as he glanced toward the board. Their faces, once composed and authoritative, now reflected shock and mounting anxiety. The judge's words, when they came, were deliberate and firm. He dismantled every claim made by the HOA, citing lack of factual basis, reliance on outdated or irrelevant documents, and the board's failure to confirm land boundaries before pursuing legal action. He described their actions as overreach and warned that filing baseless claims carries consequences, reinforcing the principle that authority cannot exist without accountability. When the ruling concluded, the HOA board members sank slightly in their seats. Their defeat was total, and the courtroom reacted with a mix of relief, subdued applause, and whispered astonishment. The farmer felt a wave of calm wash over him. Justice had been served, and the long battle to protect his land and legacy had reached its rightful conclusion. Yet the ruling included more than mere vindication. The judge ordered the HOA to cover all legal fees, reimburse the farmer for time and resources spent defending his property, and conduct a transparent accounting to ensure that dues were properly allocated going forward. The financial repercussions were severe, leaving the board scrambling to account for months of poor decision-making and reckless expenditures. Across the community, the news spread quickly. Word of the court's ruling traveled faster than any letter or email could have, carried by neighbors eager to witness accountability in action. Conversations at local stores, coffee shops, and even casual gatherings revolved around the implosion of the HOA, their failed attempts to control the farmer, and the dramatic reversal that had exposed the board's incompetence. Residents who had previously remained neutral began speaking openly about the mismanagement, sharing copies of documents and news reports with one another. The HOA internal structure began to collapse almost immediately. Several board members resigned, citing personal reasons and overwhelming public scrutiny. Others were quietly removed as the community demanded restructuring and transparency. Meetings that once exuded authority now became forums of explanation and apology. The organization's image, once considered untouchable, was now associated with arrogance, failure, and reckless pursuit of control. Mark's Farm, by contrast, became a symbol of resilience and integrity. Neighbors visited more frequently, some offering support and congratulations, others seeking advice on how to handle similar conflicts in their own lives. The barn, standing stoic against the landscape, had become more than a building. It represented history, tenacity, and the triumph of truth over bureaucracy. Though the HOA attempts to intimidate and manipulate had been relentless, they had inadvertently strengthened the farmer's reputation in the community. People who once doubted or avoided him now saw first, and the consequences of standing firm against overreach. As winter gave way to early spring, the aftermath of the case continued to reverberate. The board's efforts to regain influence failed utterly. New community guidelines were drafted with transparency and oversight, designed to prevent any future overreach. The once dominant authority of the HOA was replaced by a more accountable system, where power was distributed and documented rather than assumed. The farmer remained vigilant. Though the immediate threat had passed, he knew the community's memory of the board's actions would linger, and that future disputes might arise if vigilance waned. He strengthened fences, updated surveys, and continued detailed records of his property. But there was also relief, a sense of peace that allowed him to finally focus on farming rather than defending his rights. Over time, the HOA collapse became a cautionary tale, retold to warn against hubris, neglect, and the dangers of assuming control without due diligence. Other communities in the region referenced the case as an example of the consequences of mismanagement, sending waves of awareness far beyond the original subdivision. The board members, once accustomed to unquestioned authority, found themselves marginalized, facing legal fees and reputational damage that would take years to overcome, if ever. Meanwhile, the farmer restored his property with renewed dedication. Repairs long postponed due to stress were completed. The fields were tilled, fences reinforced, and the barn repainted and repaired as a symbol not only of preservation, but of triumph. Neighbors occasionally visited to offer assistance, bringing tools, supplies, and a newfound respect for a man who had stood his ground against intimidation. The story of the lawsuit became a narrative of resilience. It was told to visitors, neighbors, and curious parties who arrived months later, and the barn itself became emblematic of the persistence required to defend one's legacy. Even the media picked up on the community lesson, a small, well-documented act of preparedness and a refusal to yield to illegitimate authority could overcome years of assumed power. The HOA implosion also brought broader scrutiny to similar associations, spurring reviews of procedures, boundaries, and authority limits. The farmer's victory had consequences beyond his own land, affecting how HOA would operate in the surrounding counties for years to come. By the end of the year, the community began to settle into a more balanced routine. The farmer's life returned to its rhythm of planting, harvesting, and tending to his animals, yet the sense of triumph lingered. The barn had survived more than storms and seasons. It had endured human misjudgment, ambition, and legal battles. Its continued presence was a testament to persistence, preparation, and the enduring truth of property rights. The HOA, diminished and fractured, had little power to challenge the farmer again. Any remaining members operated under strict scrutiny, unable to manipulate, intimidate, or coerce without public or legal consequences. Their legacy had been permanently reshaped by the courtroom outcome and the transparency it demanded. Looking out across his property one late afternoon, the farmer surveyed the fields and the barn. The sunlight reflected off the roof, casting long shadows over the frost-dusted ground. For the first time in months, he felt entirely at peace. The barn stood strong, the land secure, and the knowledge that he had defended not only property, but family legacy offered a profound sense of fulfillment. In that quiet moment, he understood that battles, even those fueled by arrogance and overreach, could be won when truth, preparation, and patience aligned. And though the HOA had tried to claim what was never theirs, the farmer had ensured that history, law, and justice all recognized the rightful owner. The community, once torn by conflict, began to heal. Neighbors who had observed the battle from a distance now shared a common understanding. Authority must be checked, claims must be verified, and no one should underestimate the power of persistence and meticulous preparation. The barn, weathered yet enduring, became the centerpiece of that lesson, a tangible reminder of the strength found in steadfast commitment to what is right. In the end, the HOA attempt to assert control over decades old land had backfired spectacularly. What was meant as intimidation transformed into their undoing, their errors exposed for all to see. Their authority, once assumed, was permanently diminished. The farmer, through patience, preparation, and unwavering resolve, had not only preserved his property, but also reshaped community awareness, setting a precedent that would echo long after the court's gavel fell. Standing in the fading light, he took in the fields, the barn, and the quiet roads leading away from the property. Winter had ended, spring was coming, and with it, the promise of renewed life on his land. The battle was over, justice had been served, and the barn remained exactly where it had always belonged, standing as a monument to endurance, resilience, and the triumph of truth over arrogance. The HOA had tried and failed spectacularly. Farmer had prevailed, and the community had learned a lesson that would endure far longer than any one dispute.